Alright guys, so it is finally time to put the motor back in the car. So we've had some changes since I recorded part 2 of the engine reassembly video. I'll go over those in just a minute. But so for this video, we're going to go clear through putting this in the car and getting it started. I think that'll probably be, it'll depend on how much footage this ends up being as far as, filming and kind of editing and all that kind of stuff. But needless to say, we're ready to go to drop this back onto the K-member over there, connect the transmission, connect the headers, then slide the K-member underneath the car and load it back up. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this prepped and get it hanging off the engine hoist there. But before we do that, I'm gonna walk through the changes that I made in between. Why it's been about 3 weeks since I last recorded a video. Alright, so if we look here down at the bottom of the oil pan, on the back here, you can see that we have these 2 extra holes. These are actually for your bell housing to bolt to. So it's fairly common knowledge that this part of the block is fairly weak because of this, hole, I assume, is part of the casting or manufacturing process. But needless to say, this part is fairly weak. Mine has a small crack in it. It's non-structural, meaning if this breaks, it's not going to impact the actual block, or it shouldn't impact the block, and it's not really a superstructural point, but it is commonly used to pull the bell housing and transmission onto the block. I didn't do that. Mine was cracked when I pulled it off. I was told through the various people I talked to, don't worry about it. I haven't had any issues with it, but one of the things that I do like the idea of is making this not the lowest point on the motor that is bolted to. So I wanted to figure out how to utilize these bolts down here on the bottom of the GT500 oil pan. Originally I was going to make some brackets or do something like that, but it came to my attention due to a sweet friend of mine named Dylan that these guys down here on this updated bell housing from Tremec actually have bolts for this. So at some point, my assumption would have been that this GT500 oil pan was considered for the GT350. My guess is in testing they decided to go a different path, or they couldn't get it past the bean counters or whatever. But we'll find out how well it works for us. But every single GT350 that's been delivered from 2019 on has this updated bell housing with these extra set of bolts. That bolt right up to the GT500 pan, you can see my old one back there. So I had to order this. It took about 2 weeks to get it. For whatever reason, this guy does not have a new part number. So you just order the original part number for this bell housing, and this, the one that's been around since 2015, and you just get the updated version of it. So that was pretty strange, but needless to say, that took a little while for that to come in, so we've been waiting on that. But so to get started, I'm going to go ahead and put my lift plate here on the engine, bolt it down. We'll then move the engine towards the K-member there. I'm working with a very little room in here just because of how narrow my garage is, but we'll be moving this down, coming in, swinging it around, coming in behind, and lifting it up, and then pushing it forward. So it all makes sense in a minute, but I'll be right back with you just a little bit after I get some of the logistics figured out. Alright, so we're going to do a little improvisation. Had a little bit of a mic failure here, so part of this video is going to be narrated. Essentially what I'm blathering on about here is when I went to go ahead and reassemble the back of the engine here and put these rear seals in, I found out that if you're using this MMR plate here, it uses a different rear main seal than the Coyote or the Voodoo. It uses their own special MMR seal, of course. If you're working on a Voodoo, it's important to keep in mind it actually uses a different rear seal than the Coyote, and it's backwards. So a normal rear seal goes in the way everybody's used to. The Voodoo one goes in backwards. So it's important to keep that in mind, that if you're working on a Voodoo and you have a stock rear main plate, or I can't remember exactly what this part's called, but if you have a stock one, get the Voodoo rear main seal. If you have an MMR one, it should come with a rear main seal, but if it didn't, or you're replacing one like I am, where this is going to be my second, make sure you're smart and you go back to MMR and get the other one and pay their nice markup pricing, which is fantastic. All right, now time to go ahead and put this guy in. Make sure you lube it up with oil before you go ahead, and then just tap it on in. I found that a nice piece of PVC pipe, I think it was the end cap or something like that, it was either 4 or 5 inches wide or in diameter, is the best way to get fully seated. I typically start it with this. If you have the right rear main seal, it goes in a lot easier than when you're trying to shove a Coyote one in. So I promise I still hit it with my PVC part. Timing this stuff with voiceover recordings, it's much harder than you'd think. Alright, once the rear main seal is on, then we're going to go ahead and put the crank position sensor sprocket gear. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but that guy there on the back of the crank. All the holes are a very specific pattern, so it only lines up one way, so don't worry about getting it on incorrectly. And then also we're going to make sure you need to put on the bell housing sandwich plate. That is commonly what rattles when people complain about rattling between 2,500 RPM and 4,000 RPM, so just a small tidbit to fill some time. But next up, we're going to go ahead and put the flywheel on here. As I mentioned, those holes on the back of the crank are a specific pattern. They're spaced very specifically. So you can see here, I'm looking at it, trying to find it, and I'm going to rotate it around until I can get all the holes to line up. So don't worry about, or I should say, do worry about getting everything lined up before you put your first bolt in. But you don't have to worry about balancing or anything like that yet. Just make sure you get those holes lined up. And then once you do, just, don't drop it. But then once you do, put the, a couple bolts in to hold it there and then tie it down. So I don't recall, I don't believe in the service manual it calls for Loctite, but this is an area where I use Loctite. I've taken this flywheel off after I've Loctited it on probably 6 or 7 times. I've never had an issue, and so I'd recommend this. This is an area where the Voodoo creates, secondary harmonic vibrations, and it's just not worth, this coming loose on you and just completely destroying everything. So I would recommend using some Loctite on it. I put a pretty good amount. Just make sure though that if you do go with this method, before you put everything back, when you take it off and before you put it back on, you go ahead and chase those threads to remove all the Loctite from them. So what I've been doing here is I'm just putting them on loosely, not fully tight. Just I'm using the impact just because this is such a not a fun area to try to hold and manage everything. But everything on nice and loosely, get all the bolts in, and then we'll go ahead and torque these down. All right, and then as far as the torque numbers here, you want to go with 89 inch-pounds for the first set, or the first round, and that'll be in a star pattern. Then 177 inch-pounds. That also translates to about 14.7 foot-pounds. So if you don't have something that goes up that high, foot-pounds works too. And then finally, it's 59 foot-pounds for the last torque. And make sure you do everything in a star pattern. If you find out that your flywheel here is moving as you're trying to torque things down, you can just stick a pry bar in the teeth there, and then into the teeth of the flywheel, and then brace it up against part of the block here, and that's a nice way to keep it from moving. Alright, and then once your flywheel is all torqued down, we're going to go ahead and put in our little clutch alignment tool here. If you ever get bad vibrations from your clutch, if you don't properly align the clutch pack as you put it and install it here onto your flywheel, you'll get really bad vibrations, and that'll be just obnoxious on the Voodoo, and it'll just give you a lot of issues. So this is an alignment tool. The one for the regular Coyote does not fit the Voodoo clutch pack. You need a very special tool here that I can't find anywhere. I found a one for a Chevy, I believe, that's very, very close. So I went ahead and used that. It worked great for me. I've used it a couple times now and I haven't had any issues, so I highly recommend it. I'll put a link down in the description for you. Alright, so next up we're going to grab the clutch pack here, and this will just slide right on. As the 6 bolts on this guy are evenly spaced out, so you don't have to worry about getting it very specific. As long as it goes onto the center of that alignment tool and across those teeth correctly, you'll be fine. So this is once again one of those areas that I like to use blue Loctite. This is just another one of those things that would just be disastrous on this engine to come loose and allow movement or rattle or anything like that. So I just stick a bit of blue Loctite on the end of these,
ARP bolts. As far as which bolts these are just your typical M8s, and I think I went out and got specific length. This isn't a kit. They don't make a kit specifically for this clutch pack, so that's something to keep in mind. But I believe they're like 30 millimeters long, but you'll want to measure your OEM bolts to be sure for yourself. All right, and then as far as torque specs for this guy, the OEM setup is, or I should say, yeah, the OEM bolts want 34 foot-pounds, and then an additional stage 2 of 60 additional degrees. Which method you use will depend if you're using ARP bolts or not. Because I'm using ARP bolts, I went ahead and used my own torque values based on the ARP recommendations. So next up, it's going to be time to slide the bell housing, or I should say slide the transmission onto the back of the engine here. I'm using all ARP bolts. I've got, I worked my way to grab a few different sizes and lengths and stuff to make everything sure it was right. But if you're using the OEM bolts, you're going to have 35 foot-pounds and a cross pattern for each bolt. For me, because I'm using ARP, I'm going with the ARP recommendation. These are big bolts. I believe they're M10s. And so the recommendation, I believe, is right around 50 foot-pounds with their lube. So definitely much higher, but I feel much more confident using ARP's recommendation than I do with the OEM bolts. I use the OEM bolts a few times and they're fine, but I like these ARP bolts more. I went ahead and I've used this since I put everything back together, and I don't have any issues with it. So up to you, use it at your own risk if you do go down this path, but something to keep in mind. All right, next up, got the motor mount bolts here. These are much easier to do when the headers aren't on the car, especially if you use aftermarket long tubes. These guys are going to be 41 foot-pounds. These are crush nuts, if I remember correctly, the ones where they're not perfectly round. It's to help keep them from rattling loose, something to keep in mind. They're a real pain to work with, so make sure you do this when the engine is outside the car. All right, next up here, we got the starter. This guy is quite the little bugger to work with, so you're gonna want to take your time. You might need a couple pretty strange sizes for your ratchet, depending on if you're working with the engine out of the car or if you're trying to work through it, through the car. But yeah, this guy's pretty hard to get in and get everything nice and tight. I believe the torque values are 18 foot-pounds. That is what I've got. And there's one more funky bolt here. It's actually part of your motor mount bolt. This guy is, it ties into the bracket for the starter, so you have to wait to do it till later. And while the three that bolt the starter to the bell housing are 18 foot-pounds, this one here is 41 foot-pounds. All right, so now to go ahead and put the headers on. So the first thing I do is I thread a bunch of the bolts on the bottom just to get it started, and then this gives me something I can rest the headers on to keep it nice and stable. It makes it really easy to get them on. The headers are a bastard to get on. You're gonna hate your life. Cut up your hands, use every possible socket, wrench combination you have in your toolbox, and still hate yourself. But I just recommend getting these suckers as tight as you possibly can, because your voodoo is gonna rattle them loose anyway. Next up is gonna be the O2 sensor. All right, and last up here, we have to put the radiator and the radiator hoses on. Make sure you cover your radiator with cardboard in the front if you have ductwork and things like that, like I do, because it turns into a mess and it's really easy to bang up your radiator, which I learned the hard way. After you get the radiator situated and everything up there, it's time to go ahead and put the hoses on. You can see here I'm using these band clamps, spider clamps, whatever they're called. They're terrible. These were Mishimoto pieces, and I just could not get them to seal good enough to not cause leaks. I had 3 out of my 4 main radiator hose connections leak, so I highly recommend not using those. Once we're done with that, we're ready to start prepping the engine to go underneath the car again. So this is pretty self-explanatory. It's just like you'd think. You lower the car down a bit, you readjust it, you lower the car down a little bit more, you readjust it, you finagle it, you get mad, you kick things, the usual stuff, nothing too specific here. Just keep in mind that wires tend to get pinched, the headers like to rub and scratch on everything. Don't hit the hood on the ceiling of your very tiny garage like I have. That's no fun. And when you reach this point, just make sure you have the knuckles and the struts lined up so everything goes together nice and smooth. And then here I'm underneath the car attaching the transmission mount. Don't freak out about no safety. There actually are a couple floor jacks or jack stands covering me just in case. All right, and then once you got everything, once you got the K member attached, we can go ahead and start attaching the knuckles to the struts here. I found the best way is to get things close with here, and then get a bolt in there and just tap it in with a hammer. That usually helps things go in nice and smooth. I'm a huge fan of doing this step as soon as possible, just so you don't have your brake calipers continuing to hang around and potentially fall and put stress on the lines and stuff like that. So this allows you to get all this done. I don't get anything tight right away. I just get them hanging there so that they're out of the way and I don't have to worry about anything falling. All right, so bear with me here on the video quality. I had to use my cell phone for this part, but right now I've turned the car on. I'm making sure no weird errors come up, and right now I just flicked the AccuSump. So this shoots 2.5 quarts of oil into the motor to pre-oil it. It's really important with coyotes because so much of it is controlled. So much of the valve timing and the chain tensioners and all that kind of stuff are controlled with oil pressure. So you want to make sure you inject some oil at a high pressure, 80 psi or so, to provide tension to all those things, lubricate everything, and get everything ready to go for that first start when things fire. And, you got that violence and that heat injected into the motor. So I'm getting ready to start the car up here. I'm going to cut back to actual audio of this moment for you.
All right, hold on to your butts. Pressure is up. Looks like got all the bubbles out of the oil line. Wow, that sucker idles high. Look at that. Woo! I had read that oil pump from the GT500 has higher oil pressure. Damn, 110, 115? Wow, she's purring though.
That happened. That timing, quality memes. Um, I just had to say it. Like, when you say those things and you're like, no, that's like the worst thing I could have said. That was the worst thing I could have said. So as you heard, the engine started making an interesting and panic-inducing sound immediately after I said, "Wow, she's purring like a kitten." Yeah, it's classic. So I'm now 2 for 2 after rebuilding this motor of it making weird sounds on the first start. The first time, I don't remember getting it on camera, but the first time when I started it, I had one of the cam phasers malfunction on me because I don't know why. Apparently I'm an idiot or I'm just bad luck, but it made some weird sounds. We fixed that. That was fine. This one ended up being the water pump. So I didn't record much after that clip because I was in full panic mode. We were 3 days away from Coda, and I really did not expect anything to go wrong on the first start. I had taken my time. I had triple checked everything. It was just a complete disaster. So the sound initially, as you heard in that clip, did sort of sound like a water pump or like a pulley or something like that. That was pretty evident. But in that moment, it was late at night and I was really tired. And so when it made that sound, I just turned the car off and went inside the house and left. I just needed a break. I was at max stress levels, and I came back out later and I restarted again to record additional video, and it really sounded like it was coming from a different part of the car. Like it just didn't sound like the water pump. So we explored some things and checked some other areas out, and then a buddy on Instagram replied to my story at the time and was like, "Hey, try disconnecting the water pump. Pull the main pulley off, or pull the serpentine belt off and disconnect it. That way you isolate to see if it's the water pump." So we went ahead and did that, and that magically cleared it up. So fortunately, it was a simple fix. It wasn't anything to do with the bottom end of the motor. I didn't break anything like that. It was weird though, because that was a brand new water pump. It had never been used before. So I guess just bad luck on my part. But here's what the car sounded like when we went ahead and started it back up with the serpentine belt off. So as you can see, it sounded totally normal. So sequence of events that followed this that I didn't record was I finished putting the car back together. I put the front bumper on, the tires and wheels back on, did alignment, all that kind of stuff. All that stuff that I talked about how to do when I talked about removing and disassembling the car for the initial thing. I figured that would be boring to re-record, so I didn't. Plus, I was totally panic stricken. The second thing is I swapped out the water pump for the one I had used previously. So I just swapped in the old water pump and everything went back to normal with the exception of those, as I mentioned earlier in the video, those hose clamps leaked everywhere. So I ended up having to swap those. And that leads to a different story or to a much deeper story. But because I don't have like a conclusion to this video, I'm going to go ahead and include the what was going to be the first drive of the car while me and my buddy were at Coda. A couple days later, unfortunately, that event didn't go as planned, and I only drove the car for it was like 1.5 sessions. And so I figure I'll just combine these two together, and if you watched this long into the video, you get a bonus.
All right, everything good?
Nice.
All right, keeping you want my eyes on the pressure and smoke?
Yeah, I mean, just generally, you don't need to like stare at it, but just generally keep an eye on it. See if anything catches your eyes. If that fluctuates below 100, that's something to keep in mind.
Below 100?
Yeah, and if we see any like crazy amounts of smoke coming out the rear.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't look smoky right now, so that's good.
No, I think we'll be okay, but
you need to keep my eyes open?
Yeah.
Yeah. Got my things on.
I love that guy, he just doesn't care.
Yup.
That guy had some serious commitment going straight for the apex there.
Yup.
Alright. Still get... Oh, can you hear me?
No.
Okay. Good to know. Still getting heat into the motor and working on the brakes. Still got that new header wrap smell. I can smell it. So far, oil has not dropped below 100 psi. Looks to be maintaining about 110 or higher. Motor feels good so far, but we have not opened it up. Just the old gauges. Still very low tire temps. Low tire temps and the carousel at 90. That is ridiculous. God, I love this car. Oil temps holding. She sounds good. Now let's start to play with it a little bit and see how it responds. How our grip is through the carousel. Incredible. "100 miles an hour through the carousel is pretty good. Cracks and crackles with raised gas are just unreal.
All right, guys. Hopefully that makes up for the fact that I forgot to record an outro for this video and messed up all the audio and kind of just generally recorded terrible things. So hopefully that makes up for that. If you guys have any questions on this build and rebuild or anything, how it's gone so far or anything like that, please feel free to drop a comment. Unfortunately, the engine will be coming out again here in the near future, and so maybe I'll do a proper engine installation video. This one, had to prep it to go back in the car, but it kind of missed everything from once you get on the K member onward. So I'll try to do a video, or I'll try to record something better about once the engine is on the K member, what do you do? Hopefully that'll be a better video. But until next time, if you guys have any comments, as always, feel free to ask any questions you have. Reach out to me whenever. Happy to chat. All right, catch you later.